An example I often give is the Indus Valley Civilization. Nobody actually knew that it existed until it was accidentally discovered while a railway was built. And then they found that there were these actually very, very sophisticated, very complex mud brick structures on a very large scale. Then they found that this culture had a language, a fully developed written script. We can't read that script. The script exists, but we can't read it.
For 3 decades, Johnny Carson wasn't just the host of The Tonight Show. He was America's voice before bed. Millions tuned in every night, drawn to that smooth tone, the wry smile, and the effortless charm that made it seem like nothing in the world could ever rattle him. But what if the man behind the laughter was hiding something darker? Something that even his closest friends were too afraid to talk about. The cameras loved Carson, but they also protected him. Behind those bright studio lights, a very different story unfolded. One built on control, fear, and a constant need to stay in power. Hollywood's elite adored him publicly, but whispered privately about his temper, his silence, and the walls he built around himself. For a man who made his living getting others to open up, Johnny Carson may have been the most guarded entertainer in television history. His story isn't just about fame, it's about what that fame does to a person, how power isolates, how charm can disguise pain, and how the man who made America laugh every night was, in truth, haunted by the fear of being truly known. By the end of this story, you'll see Johnny Carson in a way few ever have, not as the unshakable king of late night, but as a man who spent his life running from his own reflection. But to understand the darkness, we have to start at the beginning, before the fame, before the money, before the mask. American Catchelden, Washington Catchelden. Johnny Carson's story began in the quiet, windswept town of Corning, Iowa in 1925. But the boy who would one day charm a nation wasn't born into glamour. He was born into the kind of Midwestern simplicity that values silence over spectacle. Even as a child, Johnny was different. While other kids played outside, he was busy learning how to disappear. At just 12 years old, he stumbled upon a book about magic, and that discovery changed everything. He became obsessed with illusions, sleight of hand, and the power of deception. For Carson, magic wasn't just a hobby, it was control. The ability to make people look where he wanted them to look, while something entirely different was happening in the shadows. Those early lessons would define his career. He didn't just tell jokes, he performed misdirection. While audiences laughed, he hid himself behind the punchline. Every trick, every grin, every perfectly timed pause was another layer of armor. When he joined the Navy during World War II, Carson carried that same discipline and mystery with him. He entertained fellow sailors with card tricks, but off stage he kept to himself. Few could ever say they truly knew him. That distance between performer and person became his greatest talent and his deepest curse. After the war, he studied journalism at the University of Nebraska, where he hosted a small radio show that hinted at what was to come. His wit was sharp, but his control was sharper. He knew how to read a room, how to play silence like a note in a song. By the early 1950s, television was the new frontier, and Johnny saw it as the perfect stage. He started small, writing jokes and hosting local shows before catching the eye of network producers in Los Angeles. That's where his real transformation began. By the time he appeared as a guest host on Who Do You Trust?, audiences already sensed something magnetic about him. He wasn't the loudest or the flashiest, but he had something more powerful: command. When NBC started looking for a replacement for Jack Paar on The Tonight Show, executives were cautious. Paar was temperamental, unpredictable, and brilliant in his own way. Carson seemed like the safer choice: calm, polite, and charming. The perfect man to tuck America into bed every night. But behind that polite grin was ambition. Johnny wanted control, not just of the jokes or the interviews, but the entire stage. When he officially took over The Tonight Show in 1962, he didn't just inherit a television program. He took possession of an empire. From that moment, Johnny Carson wasn't just a host. He was the gatekeeper of Hollywood dreams. Actors, comedians, and musicians all knew the rule. If Johnny liked you, your career could explode overnight. But if he didn't, your career might never recover. And as his power grew, so did the walls around him. He stopped being the man from Nebraska. He became the king of late night, the smiling illusionist who could make or break a star with a single gesture. But like all great magicians, Johnny had a secret. The trick only works as long as no one sees the truth behind it. And soon, people would start to look too closely. When the cameras turned off, the applause faded, and the guests left the stage, Johnny Carson didn't hang around. He slipped quietly into the shadows of Studio 6B, walked down the same dim hallway every night, and disappeared behind a heavy steel door that led to his private office, a place few ever entered. That was the thing about Johnny. He lived in two worlds, the one America saw and the one only he knew. On television, he was pure charisma, quick, warm, unpredictable in the best way. But off camera, the man who made millions feel like they knew him was, in truth, almost impossible to know. Staff members described him as charming at 11:30 and cold by midnight. Guests often said he was friendlier on screen than off. Even his writers sometimes went months without a personal conversation beyond a short nod or a half smile. And yet, he didn't need to talk much. His silence had weight. When Johnny Carson walked into a room, people noticed, even if he said nothing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His authority came from the power of his stillness. But that power came with a cost. Fame had built Carson into something bigger than human, a symbol. And once you become a symbol, you stop being a person. Every joke he told, every celebrity he interviewed was part of a carefully constructed wall between himself and the world. He had learned that people wanted Johnny Carson, the legend, not Johnny Carson, the man. So he gave them what they wanted. And slowly, piece by piece, the real man began to disappear. He controlled every detail of The Tonight Show, the guests, the timing, even the way the audience laughed. Writers would say that if a punchline didn't land perfectly, Johnny wouldn't yell. He'd just go quiet. That silence meant more than any outburst ever could. It meant you'd failed the king. But behind that control was something else: fear. Carson feared losing what he built. He feared rejection, humiliation, and above all, being forgotten. It's why he obsessed over ratings, why he memorized the week-to-week viewership numbers, why he'd stay awake at night replaying the moments when a joke didn't land or a guest stole his spotlight. The pressure of being America's man of the moment every night for 30 years was crushing, and the only way he could survive was by keeping everyone at arm's length. Even his closest colleagues weren't immune. Ed McMahon, his longtime sidekick, once said, "I sat next to Johnny for 30 years, but I can't say I really knew him." That distance wasn't accidental. It was by design. Johnny didn't trust easily, and by the time he was at the top, he trusted almost no one. Because fame hadn't just changed him, it had isolated him. He started drinking more heavily, using alcohol not to celebrate, but to escape. Nights after the show would stretch into long hours of solitude where the laughter of the audience still echoed faintly in his mind. The irony was cruel. The man who made everyone laugh could barely find joy himself. Behind every charming grin was exhaustion. Behind every clever line was a man trying desperately to hold his image together. And yet he couldn't stop. Television was his addiction. Control was his drug. And for years, the machine kept running until cracks started to show. Rumors began to swirl about his temper, about the icy silence that followed anyone who crossed him. Writers left quietly. Guests whispered about the other side of Johnny Carson, the one who could destroy careers with a single look. But that wasn't the full story. There was more behind that mask: pain, loss, and a trail of broken relationships that revealed just how heavy the crown of late-night royalty could be. Because what fame gives, it eventually takes back. And for Johnny Carson, the price was just beginning to show. By the late 1970s, Johnny Carson wasn't just a host. He was an institution. For millions of Americans, his show wasn't optional. It was ritual. The world might change, presidents might rise and fall, but at 11:30 p.m., Johnny would still be there. Calm, funny, and untouchable. But beneath that polished exterior, Carson had built an empire of fear. Hollywood insiders whispered that no one crossed Johnny Carson and came out clean. He didn't scream or throw tantrums like other stars. He did something far worse. He erased you. When a comedian or actor fell out of favor with him, they simply stopped getting booked. For someone in the entertainment industry, that was a career death sentence. And Carson didn't need to say it outright. His staff, his producers, even NBC executives understood the rules. One of the earliest casualties was Joan Rivers. She had been one of Johnny's favorite guest hosts, a sharp, fearless comedian who could handle the audience and keep ratings high whenever he was away. For years, she called him her mentor. But in 1986, Fox offered Joan her own late-night show, directly competing with Carson. She called Johnny to tell him, hoping he'd be proud. He didn't pick up, and from that moment on, he never spoke to her again. Not once. Not for the rest of his life. Carson banned her from The Tonight Show, and for nearly 3 decades, she was completely blacklisted from his stage. Her friends said it broke her heart. Others said it hardened her. But one thing was clear. In Johnny's world, betrayal wasn't forgiven. It was remembered. And Joan wasn't the only one. David Letterman, one of Johnny's most talented proteges, also felt the sting of his quiet wrath. Letterman had long admired Carson, and for years, many believed he would inherit The Tonight Show. But when NBC passed him over for Jay Leno, Carson didn't fight for him. He didn't say a word publicly, but in private, he was furious with NBC for the decision. Still, he kept his silence. That was his way. His silence was the punishment. Writers, producers, and even guests learned to read that silence like a warning. A short nod meant approval. A long pause meant you'd gone too far. A cold stare meant your time was up. And behind that control was the same old fear. The fear of losing his throne. Carson had built his empire through perfectionism. Every line, every reaction, every second on air had to work. When something didn't, he'd internalize it like a wound. And when someone threatened his control by being too good, too confident, or too visible, he reacted not with confrontation, but with quiet elimination. Even those who loved him admitted that his approval was addictive, and his rejection was devastating. But the people closest to him also saw something else, a man who was tired. A man who had spent so long protecting his power that he no longer knew what to do with it. His staff sometimes found him sitting alone in his dressing room, cigarette in hand, staring at nothing. Files from the last show would still be ringing in the hallways, but his face would be unreadable. No satisfaction, no joy, just quiet. The truth was, Carson's feuds weren't about ego. They were about control. Every time someone betrayed him, it confirmed his belief that no one could be trusted. Every falling out became another reason to pull away from the world. And soon, the walls he'd built to protect himself began to close in. Because while he could erase others from his life with a single decision, there was one person he could never escape: himself.
Johnny Carson was the most visible man in America, and yet no one really knew him. To his audience, he was charming, quick, and effortless. But offstage, the man who made millions laugh often struggled to laugh himself. He was married 4 times. And every marriage seems to follow the same rhythm: a dazzling start, a stormy middle, and a bitter end. His first wife, Jody Wolcott, knew him before the fame, back when he was just a young radio host in Nebraska with dreams bigger than his budget. They had 3 sons together, but Carson's obsession with work and his growing fame pushed them apart. The divorce was messy, fueled by jealousy, infidelity, and regret. By the time he met Joanne Copeland, he was already Johnny Carson, the rising television star. She was glamorous, ambitious, and for a while, they were Hollywood's picture-perfect couple. But as Johnny's fame exploded, so did the pressure. He began drinking heavily. The parties got louder, the nights longer, and the silences more dangerous. When that marriage collapsed, he retreated further into his fortress of control: the studio, the stage, and the bottle. He once told a friend, "Happiness is your dentist telling you it won't hurt and then having him catch his hand in the drill." It was a joke, but like all his jokes, there was truth hidden inside. Alcohol became both his armor and his escape. His staff learned not to bother him on certain nights. When he was drunk, his charm could turn cruel. He'd cut deep with a single comment, then wake up the next morning as if nothing had happened. In 1982, tragedy struck when his son, Richard Carson, died in a car accident. The crash was brutal. Richard's car tumbled down an embankment while he was taking photographs in California. Johnny was devastated. For weeks, he vanished from the public eye. When he finally returned to The Tonight Show, he didn't joke about it. He just sat there, quiet, for longer than anyone had ever seen him. Then, softly, he said, "Those of us who have lost loved ones know that the pain never really goes away. It changes shape, but it never leaves." It was one of the rare moments when America saw behind the curtain, and for a second, the laughter stopped. Behind the fame, Carson's life was haunted by isolation. Despite being surrounded by adoring fans and powerful friends, he trusted almost no one.
He had a small circle. His lawyer Henry Bushkin, his producer Fred de Cordova, but even they weren't immune to his cold spells. Bushkin once said that Carson could be the warmest person in the world until you disappointed him. Then you were gone. Carson's third marriage, to Joanna Holland, ended without him even knowing at first. She filed for divorce while he was still hosting The Tonight Show. He found out the same way the rest of America did, through the press. By then, Johnny had grown weary of love. He kept his fourth wife, Alexis Moss, at a distance from the spotlight. Their relationship lasted until his death, but even close friends admitted they never saw the same spark he had in his early years. In public, Carson could command a stage of millions. In private, he struggled to connect with one person. His son once said that Johnny didn't know how to express affection. Praise came rarely, and when it did, it was indirect. A smile, a nod, or a single word. The truth was, the very qualities that made him brilliant on stage, control, timing, detachment, also made him nearly impossible to love off stage. He didn't just host the show, he lived inside it. The Tonight Show wasn't just his job, it was his identity, his shield against the world. When the cameras rolled, he could be anyone. When they stopped, he wasn't sure who he was supposed to be. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, Carson began to realize something he'd spent decades avoiding. Fame doesn't fill the silence. And the silence was all he had left. Every night, after the applause faded and the lights dimmed, he would drive home in his Corvette through the dark streets of Los Angeles. No entourage, no noise, just the hum of the engine and the echo of laughter that wasn't his anymore. He once told a close friend, "The worst part about being famous isn't the people who recognize you. It's the people who don't know the real you." By then, the man who had interviewed thousands of guests and entertained millions had become his own greatest mystery. By the early 1990s, Johnny Carson had become more than a television host. He was an institution. For 3 decades, The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson wasn't just entertainment. It was America's midnight heartbeat. Every evening, millions tuned in not just for the jokes, but for the comfort of his presence, that calm voice, the timing, the raised eyebrow that said more than any punchline ever could. But behind that steady presence, Carson was growing restless. The laughter that once energized him had started to feel like an echo. The late nights, the constant performance, the endless pressure to be perfect, it all began to wear him down. He used to tell friends, "I can feel the clock ticking. Every show was one less show I'll ever do." And then one day, he simply decided, enough. He didn't announce it dramatically. There was no scandal, no meltdown. He just knew it was time. After 30 years, Johnny Carson would retire from The Tonight Show. The announcement hit like an earthquake in Hollywood. NBC executives begged him to stay. Fans wrote letters in disbelief. Even rival hosts, David Letterman, Jay Leno, admitted that late-night television would never be the same. His final show aired on May 22, 1992. There were no gimmicks, no guests, no flash. Just Johnny sitting at his desk doing what he'd done for half his life, talking to America. When the last applause faded, Carson looked into the camera and said quietly, "I bid you a very heartfelt good night." No one spoke. There was a long pause, longer than TV usually allows, and then the screen faded to black. For the first time in 30 years, America went to bed without Johnny Carson. After his retirement, Carson vanished. No interviews, no appearances, no comeback tours. It was as if he'd stepped off the stage and closed the curtain behind him forever. He turned down nearly every offer that came his way. Movie roles, TV specials, hosting gigs, all refused. He didn't need the spotlight anymore. He lived in it long enough to know how blinding it could be. He spent his final years sailing his yacht Serengeti along the Pacific coast, reading quietly and writing jokes that no one ever heard. Sometimes he'd fax them to David Letterman. Small bursts of wit, unsigned, just for fun. Letterman once said, "It was like getting a message from a ghost." Carson never stopped being sharp. He still watched late-night TV, still had opinions, but he refused to go back on camera. "When you've done it right, you don't need an encore," he told a friend. But there were secrets he never shared. Stories that stayed locked away in his home office in Malibu. After his death in 2005, archivists began cataloging his belongings. Thousands of videotapes, handwritten notes, and personal recordings. Among them were unseen monologues